When I first began working at the Mall of America, I thought it would be nothing more than a temporary job, a way to earn enough money to cover rent and perhaps distract myself from the monotony of everyday life. The sheer size of the place impressed me from the beginning. For sprawling floors, an amusement park nestled in its center, countless shops and corridors that seemed to stretch further than logic allowed. It was a city inside a building, alive with color and sound. Yet, even on that first day, something about the mall felt wrong, as though its cheerful energy was only a mask stretched over something far darker. Everywhere I looked, smiles greeted me. Staff, security guards, even mannequins posed in windows with glassy eyes and frozen grins. At first, I dismissed the unease as nerves. Who wouldn't feel intimidated by the sheer scale of a place like this? But as the hours dragged on, I noticed that the smiles lingered just a little too long, teeth flashing under the fluorescent lights, as if every face had been trained to hold a perfect mask. There was nothing warm about it. It was all performance, and it unsettled me more with each passing minute. The endless corridors played tricks on my sense of direction. Even with a map, I found myself turning down the wrong path, looping back to the same shopfronts as though the mall was gently rearranging itself when I wasn't paying attention. Once, I stepped into what I thought was a storage hallway, only to emerge in a completely different wing, far from where I'd started. A coincidence, perhaps, but the unease it stirred lingered with me long after. As night fell and the mall closed to the public, the atmosphere changed. The music faded, the cheerful announcements ended, and silence crept in like a tide. Without the crowds, the space felt impossibly vast, a hollow shell that echoed with every step. I tried to focus on my tasks, restocking shelves, checking inventory, but I could feel the emptiness pressing down, as if the building itself was aware of me. I wasn't alone, not really. The mannequins stood guard behind their glass displays, their fixed smiles catching the faint glow of overhead lights. I could almost swear their heads had shifted slightly since earlier, tilting towards me as though watching. My supervisor was one of the permanent staff, a tall man with neatly combed hair and that same unsettling smile. He gave no warmth in his words, no humor in his tone, only instructions spoken with mechanical precision. His eyes never seemed to blink. I caught myself staring, trying to find a flicker of humanity behind them, but there was nothing. It was as though he was reciting lines from a script he had long since memorized. By the end of my first shift, the unease had settled into my bones. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I'd grow used to the strange rhythms of the mall. Yet, when I stepped outside into the night air, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed me, some unseen presence brushing against my shoulder as I crossed the car park. For a brief moment I considered quitting then and there, but the pay was steady, the hours reliable, and I convinced myself that the dread was only in my imagination. Still, as I closed my eyes to sleep, I could see their smiles. Those uneasy, perfect smiles burned into the darkness behind my eyelids. And deep down, a part of me already knew the mall wasn't what it seemed. By the second week, I had learned that the Mall of America had two faces: the bustling, brightly lit haven for shoppers during the day, and the hollow labyrinth of silence after closing hours. It was in the latter that the true nature of the place revealed itself. Once the shutters rolled down and the last visitors departed, a strange pressure filled the air, a sense that the walls themselves were listening. The echo of my footsteps carried too far, as though bouncing off surfaces not visible to the eye, coming back distorted, delayed, as if walking beside me. I grew familiar with the nightly tasks, sweeping corridors, arranging displays, helping lock away tills. Yet the routines did little to ease the disquiet. There were places I avoided when I could. Long stretches of empty hallways where the light bulbs flickered in a rhythm that seemed almost intentional, or certain corners where the air smelled faintly of damp earth, though no water should have been near. On more than one occasion, I heard movement behind me. A scuff, a shuffle, the unmistakable cadence of footsteps. But when I turned, the space was empty. The security guards carried themselves differently at night. During the day, they blended with the scenery, friendly enough, answering questions and pointing visitors to shops. But once the gates were locked, They moved like wardens patrolling a prison, their torches cutting through the dark with sharp beams. Their radios crackled often, not with voices but with bursts of static that seemed to form shapes, like whispers trapped inside the signal. When I asked one of them, half joking, if the place was haunted, he smiled in that same stiff, unnatural way I had already come to dread and simply walked off without answering. It was during one of those night shifts that I noticed something that unsettled me far more than footsteps or static. While cleaning a corridor near the upper levels, I spotted a girl standing at the far end. She was dressed in ordinary clothes, too plain to be one of the mannequins, and yet she stood perfectly still beneath the dim lights. Her head was tilted slightly, hair obscuring her face. I called out, thinking she must have been a lost shopper somehow left behind, but she did not move. I began walking towards her, but with each step forward, the corridor seemed to stretch, the distance between us never closing. And then, as the lights flickered overhead, she was simply gone, dissolved into the air as though she had never been there at all. After that, every corridor seemed alive with unseen watchers. The echoes of my movements grew heavier, layered, as if more than one person followed just beyond the edge of vision. My reflection in the darkened shop windows grew stranger too, lagging slightly, eyes not always aligned with mine, lips curving into faint expressions I had not made. It was subtle, easy to dismiss if one didn't look too closely, but I could not stop staring. The mall was testing me, I realized. It wanted me to notice. By the end of that shift, when I finally walked the endless halls towards the staff exit, I swore the air itself was breathing. Each fluorescent tube hummed like a heartbeat. Each shadow whispered my name. The mall was no longer just a workplace. It was something else. Something vast, patient, and alive. And I was beginning to understand that I had only scratched the surface of what lay beneath its endless corridors. It was during my third week that I began to spend more time in the security office. The supervisors insisted on it, claiming it was part of orientation, though I had already been there long enough to know the routines. The office itself was a cramped room, filled with the constant buzz of fluorescent light and the low hum of machinery. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old wiring and overheated circuits. Along the walls, monitors flickered endlessly, each screen capturing a different angle of the mall. The food courts, the rides, the darkened corridors after hours. At first, I thought of it as a relief. Watching the feeds from a chair was easier than walking the endless floors, and I felt safer behind a locked door with the glowing screens around me. But it didn't take long before I realized the footage revealed more than I ever wanted to know. The first thing I noticed was how the cameras didn't always agree with one another. In one feed, I could see a security guard walking down a corridor. Yet, in the neighboring camera, which should have shown the same space from another angle, the corridor was empty. Sometimes the footage lagged, freezing for a few seconds before catching up, but during those frozen moments, figures continued to move, shapes that weren't supposed to be there. I pointed this out to the man on duty, one of the permanent staff. He barely glanced at the screen, his eyes dull, his face locked in that uncanny smile. "The system glitches," he muttered, his voice flat, as though he had said the same words 100 times before. But when I looked back at the screen, the frozen figure, a tall, thin silhouette at the far end of the corridor, remained, staring directly at the camera. It didn't move. It didn't blink. It simply watched. The more time I spent there, the more I noticed the patterns. Every night, around the same hour, shadows gathered in certain places. The arcade, the staff corridors, the closed wings of the upper floors. They lingered for long stretches, unmoving, their outlines blurred but undeniably human. Yet when I asked the guards if they ever checked those areas, they shook their heads with quiet finality. "Not our job," one of them muttered before turning away. What disturbed me most wasn't just the figures, it was the reflections. In the empty food court, the plastic tables and chairs sat untouched. Yet in the windows lining the walls, I could see faint outlines of people sitting there, hunched over invisible meals, moving as if trapped in a silent pantomime. Their reflections shifted when no one was there, their mouths opening and closing in unheard conversations. The screens hissed faintly whenever I stared too long, as if warning me to look away. One night, the monitors flickered in unison, a ripple that passed through all of them at once. For a split second, every screen showed the same image. The mall's atrium, viewed from above, filled with hundreds of people standing shoulder to shoulder. Their faces were tilted upwards, all of them staring directly at the camera. Then, just as quickly, the screens returned to normal, showing nothing but empty corridors and darkened shops. I asked the guard beside me if he had seen it too. He turned, his eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second before sliding back to the monitors. His lips curved into that same faint, lifeless smile. "Don't watch too closely," he said quietly, almost like a warning. "They don't like it when you watch them." From then on, every time I entered the security office, I felt as though the mall itself was aware of me. The figures on the screens seemed to linger longer when I was there, their blank faces pressing against the edge of the glass. Sometimes, their heads would tilt ever so slightly, not towards the camera, but towards me, as though they could see through the lens, through the wires, into the very room where I sat. And when I left, I could still feel their gaze following me down the corridors, echoing in every step, waiting for the moment I would look back. The first time I noticed the shadows, I thought it was fatigue. Long hours and the stale glow of fluorescent lights will trick the eyes. Shapes shift where there should be none, corners seem darker than they are, and the mind fills the gaps. At least that's what I told myself. But denial only goes so far when the impossible repeats itself night after night. It began in the atrium, near the amusement park rides. After closing, when the music was silenced and the rides stood motionless, the space became cavernous, almost holy in its silence. I was walking across the polished floor when I caught sight of movement against the far wall. A shadow, tall and distorted, sliding across the surface. There was nothing nearby to cast it. No worker, no cart, no flickering bulb. It stretched impossibly long, bending at an angle that did not match my position or the overhead lights. When I stopped, it stopped. When I took a step forward, it seemed to lean closer, as though listening. From then on, I saw them everywhere. In shopfront glass, in the glimmer of stainless steel lifts, even on the pale tiles of the toilets. Shadows would ripple against the wall when I entered, shifting like figures moving just out of reach. Once, while mopping a corridor late at night, I looked up to see two shadows at the end of the hall, side by side, holding hands. Yet the space was empty, my mop water trembling as though shaken by footsteps I could not hear. I tried to speak to a colleague about it, one of the few temporary workers who hadn't yet been consumed by that lifeless smile. She brushed it off, laughing nervously, until one night she froze mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "Behind you," she whispered. I turned, and for a split second I saw it too. A shape far taller than any human, stretched across the corridor wall, head bowed low. Then it melted away, leaving only the buzzing of the light above us. She never came back after that shift. Her name was removed from the rota as though she had never been hired in the first place. The worst encounter came in the staff corridors, narrow spaces with peeling paint and a stench of damp. I was walking alone when I saw my own shadow move differently to me. My arms swung naturally, yet the shadow's hands hung stiff at its sides. My head turned one way, its head another. Then, slowly, it lifted an arm and pressed its palm flat against the wall, even though I had not moved. I stumbled back, the torchlight shaking in my hands, and for an instant, I thought it would step free, leaving me behind. But it only lingered, faceless and silent, until I ran. By then I understood the truth. These shadows were not accidents of light. They were residents of the mall, just as real as the mannequins, just as patient as the staff who never left. They lived in the thin spaces, where reflection and reality bled into each other, watching, waiting, learning the shape of my movements. That night, as I finally reached the staff exit, I dared to glance back at the polished glass doors. There were 3 shadows cast against the floor, long and sharp under the fluorescent light. But only one of them was mine. The longer I worked inside the Mall of America, the more I realized that the strangest part of the job wasn't the size of the building, the endless corridors, or even the shadows that moved without source. It was the staff, the ones who had worked there for years, the so-called permanent employees. At first glance, they looked ordinary enough, neatly dressed in uniforms or casual clothes depending on their role. But if you lingered long enough, if you studied them closely, you would see the truth. They were far too perfect. Every smile was identical, the same precise stretch of the lips, the same flash of teeth, the same subtle tilt of the head. They never seemed to blink, or if they did, it was at the same moment, as though rehearsed. Their voices carried the same tone. Flat, measured, stripped of warmth. Ask them anything, and they answered with mechanical politeness, but never with depth. It was like speaking to a recording, a copy of a person that had forgotten how to sound real. I began testing them without meaning to. I'd make small talk about the weather, about news outside the mall, about music I'd heard on the radio. Each time the answer was short, vague, recycled. Not one of them ever mentioned a life beyond the mall. No families, no homes, no mornings or nights outside these walls. When I asked one man what he did on his days off, his eyes lingered on me just a second too long before he smiled and said, "I work." The words weren't strange, but the way he said them sent a shiver crawling up my spine. It wasn't only their behavior, it was their presence. They were always near, even when there was no reason for them to be. I'd turn a corner and find one standing motionless, staring down the hall. I'd leave the staff room at 2 in the morning, only to see another standing by a vending machine, not eating, not drinking, just waiting. Sometimes I'd catch them all at once, gathered in small groups, their faces blank, their heads turning slowly to follow me as I passed. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I stayed later than usual in the staff corridors, listening. The air vents carried faint sounds, murmurs, the rise and fall of voices. At first I thought it was conversation, but as I leaned closer, I realized the voices weren't speaking in any language I recognized. It was repetition, rhythmic and low, like a chant, seeping through the vents in steady pulses. When I asked one of the guards about it, his smile tightened and he shook his head. "We don't ask questions here," he said softly. "It's better that way." That was when I noticed the small details I had ignored before. Their uniforms never creased. Their shoes never scuffed. Their hair never moved, not even in the draft of the vents or the sudden gust of the opening doors. They looked as though they had stepped out of a catalog and stayed that way, frozen in time. And perhaps most disturbing of all, I never saw them leave. When my shift ended and I trudged out into the car park, the permanent staff were still inside. When I returned the next day, they were there again, standing in the same places, their smiles waiting for me. By the end of my 5th week, the thought began to settle in my mind like a sickness. These weren't people in the normal sense. They were part of the mall, as much a fixture as the escalators or the glass displays. They had been shaped by it, molded into something that looked human but was no longer entirely real. And as I lay in bed that night, their faces followed me into my dreams. Perfect smiles, perfect voices, perfect silence. The staff who seemed too perfect were watching, waiting, and I knew I was being drawn into their number with every passing shift. I found the door when the arcade's lights were tired and the crowds had gone. It was a thin seam in a wall customers never glanced at, hidden by a broken crane and the dust of 1,000 cheap prizes. At first it seemed like a trick of plaster and shadow, but when I touched it the surface was colder than the air and it hummed faintly, like something breathing beneath the skin of the mall. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in places that have long memories, and curiosity pulled me across the line. The passage beyond was not on any plan I had been given. It plunged away from the bright avenues into a small, narrow tunnel lit by a single stubborn bulb. The air changed at once, losing the sweet plastic tang of the arcade and picking up damp cardboard and old paper. Walls that upstairs gleamed now flaked, and doors stood where maps suggested nothing should be. At the far end a metal hatch sat low and bolted, its rim scarred as if something powerful had tried to lift it and failed. It looked wrong in a building of gloss and friendliness, like a secret sewn into the underlayer. When my hand brushed the hatch it throbbed under my palm, slow and steady, like a heartbeat that acknowledged my presence. The vents above, which had murmured for days, rose into a chorus that I could not parse as words. It was less speech and more weight pressing at the back of my skull, a suggestion rather than instruction. For a moment all I wanted was outward movement, the safe blur of bright corridors and tired smiles. Instead I felt that the mall had been preparing this space for me, that doors and staff and flickering bulbs had been arranged to bring someone here when the time came. A figure stood at the far end of the tunnel, one of the permanent staff whose smile never changed. He moved as if from gears, slow and precise, and his eyes held the same flat light I had seen in the security office. He did not speak. He only watched as I crouched and rested my hand on the cold metal. The sound then rose, a scrape, like fabric dragged across concrete, and the hatch answered with a faint vibration that made my teeth ache. Fear told me to retreat, but another force, thinner and older, urged me closer, and I felt it in the way the corridor made room around us. Behind the staff member I saw doors ajar that hid rooms with contents that made me want to look away. Crates of vinyl records stamped with dates that predated them all, torn mannequins bundled in sheets, boxes of photographs with faces rubbed away. The further I peered, the less sense the place made. Time was fractured here. Objects from many lives and many decades sat side by side as though the mall had been gathering pieces for a long game. The hatch was the centerpiece, the only visible seam where the building's appetite bled into something below. When the staff member came closer, his footsteps measured, I realized I was no longer certain which of us was the observer. He tilted his head, a small, almost formal motion, and something in the corridor shifted with approval. The venting sighed, growing louder until the sound pressed against my eardrums. I tried to speak and my voice became someone else's memory, thin and uncertain. There was a choice in that breathless moment, to pull back and keep the secret folded, or to prise the hatch and see what the mall had been keeping for itself. My fingers tightened on the rim. The metal was slick with cold, as if wet, but it bore no stains I could name. The vibration beneath my palm matched my pulse now, a steadying rhythm that felt absurdly intimate. The staff member stopped a pace away and set his hands together as though at prayer. Then, softly and without the movement of lips, I understood immediately. The corridor said to me that I had been chosen. That words, rotas and small allowances had been arranged to bring me to this hatch, and bringing me had been part of a pattern I did not yet see in full. I had an image then of the mall like a living organism, neat corridors serving as arteries, shops as skin, permanent staff as placid, obedient cells. The hatch was its belly, the slow organizing center that gathered what the mall could not burn away. Behind me a faint clang echoed as something deeper shifted into position. The staff member's smile widened in a way that was not human, and the light above trembled. The corridor seemed to lean in through the walls. At the edge of movement my breath hitched and the choice closed like a trap. I felt both dread and a furious clarity. To open would be to know, to leave would be to pretend ignorance forever. The hatch gave under a small pressure I did not wholly own, and as the rim scraped against its seat a sound like 100 tiny sighs rose from beneath. The staff member's hands did not move. He only watched me with the calm of something that has waited long enough for its appointment. Something beneath the metal answered, lifting in a motion that was slow and inexorable. The corridor filled with a temperature that tasted like old coins and rain. I had the thought, sharp and absurd, that whatever lay under the mall had been expecting me to find it, that the building fed on being discovered and fed worse on the discovery's consequence. The hatch slipped farther and a narrow dark opened, and from that throat came the smallest sound, not quite a voice but a call that slid directly into my bones. The words reached me as if from inside my own skull rather than from the black itself. You came. What I found beneath that hatch did not belong to any map, nor to the clean and orderly world that the mall presented above. The steps spiraled downwards, narrow and wet, carved from concrete that seemed far older than the mall itself. My torch beam barely pierced the gloom, and the air thickened with the scent of rust and soil, as though the building's bowels had been carved directly into the earth. The further I descended, the more it felt like the mall was swallowing me whole, drawing me deeper into its gut. At the bottom, the space widened into a network of tunnels. Crates sat stacked along the walls, each one marked with numbers and dates in fading ink. Some bore labels from decades before the mall's construction. Yet they looked untouched, preserved as though time had frozen around them. When I pried one open, I found clothing folded neatly inside. Jackets, shoes, children's dresses, each one tagged with names that meant nothing to me. Their fabrics were stiff with age, and yet none bore dust. It was as if they had been left only hours earlier. The further I explored, the stranger it became. In one chamber, rows of mannequins stood in silence, their faces blank, their limbs wired into rigid poses. But these mannequins were not like the ones above. Their skin was cracked and mottled, their glass eyes clouded with something disturbingly organic, like cataracts forming across a living gaze. The longer I stared, the more I felt as though I was intruding on something that had been placed here deliberately, hidden away not because it was broken, but because it was unfinished. Another corridor revealed boxes of photographs. Black and white portraits at first, then color, each image showing families, shoppers, children grinning in front of places that looked familiar. My skin crawled when I recognized the atrium, the roller coasters, the bright shop fronts. But the dates scrawled on the back were decades older than the mall itself. Entire generations had been captured inside photographs of a place that had not yet been built. Some of the faces I recognized too well. They belonged to the permanent staff. The same smiles, the same unblinking eyes, unchanged across decades. I began to feel dizzy, my head swimming with the weight of what I was seeing. The air in the tunnels seemed alive, vibrating faintly with every breath. The walls wept with moisture, not water but something thicker, leaving streaks that glistened under my torch. I ran my fingers across one streak before I could stop myself, and it clung to my skin like oil. My stomach turned, and I wiped it away quickly, though the sensation lingered long after. At the center of the tunnels stood a chamber larger than all the others, its ceiling arched high, lined with pipes that groaned as though carrying not water but whispers. In the middle, chairs were bolted to the ground in a neat circle. Each seat had restraints at the arms, rusted but functional, as if waiting patiently for occupants. Scattered around them were personal belongings. A handbag, a cracked watch, a child's toy bear. None had gathered dust. None looked abandoned. They looked placed, prepared. That was when I understood. The mall wasn't only a place for commerce or amusement. It was a vessel, a machine designed to gather and to keep. Consumed not just money, not just time, but something far deeper, people themselves. Their smiles, their reflections, their lives, stored and displayed, recycled and repurposed in a ritual that had begun long before I ever walked through its doors. I should have left then. I should have turned back and sealed the hatch, walked away from those secrets buried beneath the shops. But something stronger than fear held me there, an invisible weight pressing down, whispering that I had already seen too much, that there was no turning back, not now, not ever. And in that suffocating silence, I heard movement behind me, a shuffle of feet, a breath that wasn't mine. When I turned, my torch caught the reflection of eyes in the darkness. Too many eyes, staring from between the crates, watching with patient hunger. The eyes withdrew when the beam of my torch touched them, slipping back into the dark like animals trained to wait. Yet I knew they were not animals. The cadence of their breathing was too steady, too rehearsed, like people mimicking the act of life. My pulse thudded in my ears as I backed into the central chamber, where the circle of bolted chairs stood waiting, and I understood why the mannequins above had always seemed so eerily familiar. They were not displays at all. They were remnants, placeholders for something that began down here. On the wall above the chairs hung photographs layered in thick frames, each image showing shoppers with wide, unnatural smiles. The same faces reappeared across different decades, unchanged except for their clothes. The ritual was clear even before I wished to name it. People came here, brought here, and something beneath the mall reshaped them into those smiling husks who wandered the corridors upstairs. It was not a choice, not an accident. It was design. The vents above my head opened with a hiss, spilling out air that reeked of perfume and rot. The sound carried with it a hum, a rhythm I had heard in the service tunnels before, and with every breath I felt it gnaw at the edges of my will. My jaw clenched and relaxed without permission, lips twitching as if my face wanted to form a smile against my command. The deeper the hum pressed, the harder it became to resist, until my reflection in the polished metal of the chair arms began to grin back at me with a mouth that was not my own. I stumbled backwards, striking one of the crates, and the lid cracked open. Inside lay a row of porcelain masks, each painted with a perfect grin, the kind worn by the permanent staff whose faces never faltered. They were waiting to be claimed, to be fitted onto whoever next descended into these tunnels. The hum swelled as if pleased, and in its vibration I heard something like words, though not spoken aloud: smile and belong. Shadows moved between the crates, and the watchers crept forward at last. Their bodies were wrong, too stiff, too deliberate, as if each joint was forced into motion. When my torchlight brushed across their faces, I wished I had never looked. They wore fragments of those porcelain masks, fused with flesh, their mouths stretched in eternal grins that revealed not joy but horror. Their eyes, however, told the truth, wide, desperate, pleading, as if trapped behind the painted veneer. The circle of chairs seemed to call to them, and as they advanced, I realized they were not coming for me directly. They were guiding me, herding me towards the seats, towards the center of the ritual. Every instinct screamed to flee, but the air thickened with the weight of command. The hum was inside my skull now, urging me to sit, to surrender, to join the endless rows of smiling shells that haunted the mall's upper floors. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did nothing. The sound was not external. It came from the marrow of the building itself, vibrating through the pipes, the walls, even the stone beneath. The ritual was woven into the very foundation. For 30 days I had thought I was merely working a job, scanning passes, cleaning corners, but all the while the mall had been studying me, measuring me, deciding whether I was worthy to be consumed. The watchers drew closer, their teeth glinting beneath painted smiles. My back struck one of the chairs, and the restraints clattered open with a metallic snap as though welcoming me. I felt the cold bite of steel against my wrist, and in that instant the choice narrowed to a single thread: submit and be remade, or fight and vanish into whatever fate awaited those who resisted. I forced my eyes shut, dragging in a ragged breath, but even in the dark I saw the images. Faces stretched into identical grins, families erased and replaced with mannequins of flesh. The mall was not merely a building. It was a hive, a temple, a machine of assimilation, and I had been brought to its altar. Then, from somewhere deeper still, below the hum and below the watchers' breaths, came a sound like laughter. Not the laughter of people, but something vast and ancient, echoing as though it rose from the soil itself. The watchers froze for a moment, their heads tilting in unison, as if listening for new instructions. The restraints on the chair rattled again, eager, impatient. And in that pause, I realized the mall was not done with me yet. This was not the end of the ritual. This was only the beginning. I thought that if I could drag myself back above ground, slam the hatch shut and lock the secret away, the mall would lose interest. I was wrong. Leaving did not end its work. It merely moved it. The voices that had spoken under the vents and hummed through the pipes found me wherever I tried to hide, slipping into the ordinary hours of my life as if they had always belonged there. They were patient, like the building itself, and where patience fails, persistence will do the job. The night I fled, I took the stairs 2 at a time, and the hatch slammed behind me with a sound that echoed like a verdict. I ran through corridors that suddenly seemed familiar in a new, terrible way, as if the mall had memorized my route and was folding it around me. Permanent staff fell back into their posts as I passed, faces unchanged, thin smiles curving like tiny traps. I burst through the final service door into the fluorescent twilight of the atrium, and only stopped when the cold night air hit my face. For a heartbeat I imagined I had escaped the ritual, that the hive would be denied its next offering. But even as I drove away, with the building shrinking in my rearview mirror, a notion scraped the inside of my head. The mall had never intended to hold me only while on the clock. At home, sound became a new kind of prison. The vents in my flat carried far less air than the mall, yet every gust arrived threaded with consonants and sibilants that did not belong to the weather. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the boiler, the cough of the city beyond the window, all of them took on a cadence that matched the whispers I had heard in the tunnels. They shifted from suggestion to sentence, phrases forming with the lazy deliberation of someone folding a letter. Come back. Sit with us. Smile. At first I convinced myself it was dizziness, the residue of stress and the fluorescent lights. Then I heard my name, clear and absurd as a bell, spoken from the speaker of my kettle as it boiled. Sleep stopped being rest and became a vigilance. Every creak of the floorboards was a footstep. Every shadow at the corner of a curtain carried the suggestion of a face. I would wake to the taste of copper in my mouth and the echo of voices threading through the steam of my shower. Friends who called saw only the raggedness at the edge of my voice and offered the brittle comfort of casual suggestions. Get some rest, take a day off. Answers that only emphasized how wrong their language was for what I endured. They did not hear the undertow. They did not feel the small pressure in their hollow of the throat that told me I was being invited, coaxed, rehearsed into smiling like them. Work became unbearable in a different way. The mall watched me more openly now, as if whatever decision had been made underground had authorized a more explicit stage. Cameras that had once blurred figures now focused with a subtle intent. Reflections in shop glass showed me performing gestures I had not yet made. Conversations among permanent staff dissolved into long silences as I passed, only to resume with laughter that sounded as though it had been mixed from other mouths. Yet I could not simply quit. Every plan I formed to leave was undermined by 100 small sabotages. A cancelled interview, a phone that slipped from my hands and fractured, my bus route mysteriously diverted, so I would find myself walking past the brightly lit facade at midnight, doors blurred into a place I could not name. It was as if the building arranged the world to return me to it. The voices grew more intimate and more invasive. They did not merely call. They suggested. They recited my own thoughts back to me in ways that made me second-guess which ideas were mine and which were implanted. At odd moments I found myself humming a tune I did not remember learning, smiling at a memory that was not mine, pausing at shop windows to watch a reflection that looked stranger with every glance. Once, in the quiet early hours, my phone rang and an automated voice recited a shopping announcement I knew well from the mall. Special offers today in the East Wing. The voice then added, almost conversationally, "We miss you." The rational part of me wanted to smash the device, to burn the SIM card, but an irrational piece kept it next to my bed like a talisman, listening for the next instruction. People began to notice the change in me. My gait stiffer, my face pulled taut at the corners, my eyes hollow. A neighbor left a note sliding under my door asking if I was all right. I wrote back a scribbled apology and then found the note returned the next morning, folded in an exact square with a polite message printed on bright card. "We hope to see you soon." The paper smelled faintly of arcade plastic and powdered sugar. The mall's influence had braided its way into the small arteries of my life. And still it escalated. The nights when I tried to stay away, to sit in cafes with the cheap music and avoid familiar streets, the voices simply joined the soundscape elsewhere. They found telephone booths, vending machines, the lullaby looped on the train station speakers. On a day when I thought to visit the seaside for the expansive horizon, a busker on the promenade sang the chorus I had heard underground, his lips forming the very cadence of the ritual. He stared at me as if expecting a nod, and the world shuddered into a sequence of scenes meant for a performer who did not know his lines. At last, after 3 weeks of hollowed sleep and frayed edges, I decided I would try to leave for good. I told myself that if the mall could not be outrun, it could at least be faced. I packed a single small bag, left my flat with keys in hand and a heart that hammered a dangerous rhythm, and drove back towards the lights that had first tempted me into employment. I told myself I would not go inside. I would walk to the front, cross the car park, step through the exit and never return. That was the plan. As I parked and walked up the pavement, the atrium rose ahead like an enormous, indifferent mouth. The automatic doors reflected 1,000 pinpricks of light. People do not notice, I thought, how those doors mirror you before they open. They offer you your image to reassure you of continuity. Mine did not reflect me at all. The glass showed a taller figure in a uniform, head tilted with that practiced angle, smiling in a way my lips could not mimic. I felt the warmth drain from me. I heard the distant hum of the vents, patient as a promise. I had almost reached the glass when the figure inside the reflection lifted a hand and pressed its palm to the other side. I paused, every instinct screaming to flee and another, older compulsion whispering to step forward. The doors shuddered but did not open. Behind the glass, the permanent staff were already gathering, their ranks smooth and endless. The reflection's smile widened. And then, very clearly, the glass whispered my name. When the glass whispered my name, something inside me faltered. It was not a sound that belonged to air or breath. It was the mall itself speaking, using the reflection as its mouth. My pulse thundered in my throat, yet my body leaned forward against my will, drawn by the unseen current that had been pulling me for weeks. The reflection's palm pressed harder against the glass, and my own hand lifted in answer before I could resist. The cold surface met my skin, and in that instant, the glass did not feel like a barrier but a membrane. Thin, alive, and waiting to be crossed. The automatic doors hissed open at last, though no one had approached from inside. The mall breathed me in like a lung drawing its fill. I stumbled across the threshold and the world behind me dissolved. Outside sounds, the traffic, the wind, the city's pulse, vanished as if the doors had sealed not just space but reality. Within, the air was heavy, perfumed with sugar and metal, thick enough to taste. Every light overhead flared to life at once, flooding the atrium in a glow too sharp to be welcoming. The staff were waiting, not just a handful, but dozens, their identical uniforms lined across the balconies, leaning over railings, faces tilted in perfect unison. Their smiles were so wide now that the skin at their cheeks seemed ready to split. And yet their eyes, those eyes that had stared from photographs and mannequins, were as empty as extinguished stars. When I tried to speak, the sound was stolen from my throat. It was not silence but theft. The mall had claimed even the right to my own voice. The hum began again, deeper than ever, a vibration that seemed to rise through the floor itself, through my bones, aligning with the frantic beat of my heart. The escalators moved though no passengers rode them, circling endlessly as if ferrying invisible crowds to a place I could not see. The rides in the amusement park spun without children, their painted horses grinning with teeth too sharp. Every shop window reflected not goods for sale but fragments of my face, each one wearing that same perfect, unbearable smile. I tried to run. The corridors bent and folded, denying me an exit, turning every path into a loop that spat me back into the atrium. My breath came ragged, the taste of copper on my tongue, and yet the mall would not let me collapse. It held me upright, guiding me with subtle pushes, herding me towards the very place I had sworn never to return. The service door, the hatch, the spiraling descent. My protest was nothing to it. The building had chosen me from the first day I clocked in. Everything since had been rehearsal. When I reached the hatch again, it was already open, its black throat breathing cold air into the corridor. The watchers emerged from the dark, their porcelain fragments gleaming, their smiles stretched wide and brittle. They did not grab me. They did not need to. I walked between them as if compelled by the rhythm of their footsteps, the hum filling every hollow in my body. My wrists slid into the restraints of the chair without struggle, as though my limbs had practiced the movement in dreams I could not recall. The metal clamped shut with a finality that made my ribs ache. Overhead, the lights flickered, and I felt the mall settle, satisfied, as if a piece of machinery had clicked into place. The air thickened, humming louder, until I no longer knew whether the vibrations came from outside or within me. My lips twitched and, helplessly, curved upwards. My face froze in the perfect grin, my jaw aching as the mask slipped into place, invisible yet undeniable. For the first time, the whispers did not come from vents or walls. They came from inside my skull. They did not invite now. They commanded. You belong. You smile. You serve. And I realized the terrifying truth. The staff I had thought were too perfect, too hollow, too unchanging. They were not people at all, not anymore. They were what I was becoming. The mall had never been a place of shopping or leisure. It was a vessel, a machine feeding on identity, carving away choice until only the smile remained. Shoppers were its harvest, staff its husks, and I was simply one more name on a list written long before I was born. My last thought, as the hum consumed me and the smile became permanent, was not of escape or defiance but of inevitability. The mall had waited for me patiently, and now it had me, and it will never let me go.